MRCT Center podcast. We are the multi-regional clinical trial center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. Our mission is to engage diverse stakeholders to define emerging issues across all stages of global clinical trials and to create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. Hello. Welcome to our podcast series on Trials Beyond Borders, Building Representative Clinical Trials Worldwide. I'm Willianne DeCormier-Plasky, a program director leading our DE&I efforts at the MRCT Center. I will be your moderator today, and I'm joined by Catherine Wright, a freelance ethics consultant on this project who was previously with the UK-based Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and our special guest, Tanea Gray, Global Head of Diversity in Clinical Trials at the CRO ICON PLC. I also want to give credit to Hayat Ahmed, a program manager who has been spearheading global diversity, equity, and inclusion at the MRCT Center, and she's kind of managing from behind the scenes today. So thank you all so much for being here. For the moment, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to give us an introduction to the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Project.
Thank you, Willianne. So just to start with a little background on the MRCT Centre's project on global diversity, equity, and inclusion. This project had two main aims. Firstly, to gain a deeper understanding of DEI issues in clinical research across the world. So in particular, asking what does diversity mean in different regions and countries, and the implications of that for access to research and access to healthcare, so better healthcare being the fruits of research. And this involved engaging with a wide variety of stakeholders across different world regions, including sponsors and CROs, regulators, ethics committee members, health departments, principal investigators, and others. And then secondly, we wanted to draw on these insights to enhance and broaden the MRCT Centre's existing resources on DEI to incorporate this more global perspective. And that's both to help support DEI initiatives in research within individual countries, but also really importantly to help support DEI in multi-country studies, where the complexities of thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion are inevitably magnified. We recently published our key findings in a short article in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, and that's called First Do No Harm. And that emphasises the importance of focusing really clearly in on the needs and interests of individual countries and their populations. So, for example, not just thinking about US demography when planning diverse recruitment for trials. And now to help embed this learning into day-to-day practice, we've drafted 4 practical tools. So these include a roadmap aimed at the organisational level to help to prompt the development of a global DEI strategy. So that's aimed mainly at sponsors and CROs. A model for a diversity action plan, ADAPT, that includes global as well as US considerations. Thirdly, a tool for researchers to really help embed ethical considerations relating to global DEI into research from the very beginning. And finally, a resource to help those interested in working in partnership with other countries, other stakeholders, to help strengthen research capacity around the world. Because a key theme from the conversations we had was the important role that research capacity plays in enabling more diverse participation in research. So the first of those 2 tools, the roadmap and the modelled app, are being launched today with this podcast, and we aim to launch the other 2 later in the year. Over to you, Willianne.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I'm really excited to see the launch of these tools, and hopefully they're going to be a great resource for everybody working in DE&I across countries around the world. I wanted to first turn it over to Tanea, and before we launch into the questions, just maybe a little background on why you're interested in global DE&I, why you think it's important.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for that welcome and introduction. As ICON's Global Head of Diversity in Clinical Trials, my primary concern is access and widening access to clinical trials for all. And so when we speak about for all, it's wonderful to hear this recent focus on understanding that diversity is a global phenomenon. According to the last FDA snapshot summary, Americans are significantly overrepresented in clinical trials as trial participants. And so as we approach conversations about relevance and rates of participation and rates of uptick of medicinal therapies and other products it's really important that we are having that in those conversations, if you will, in a global context. And so that's really important to me. And, I'm happy to dive in a little bit about how we as a global CRO are planning to approach this.
Thanks, Tanae. I think your comment on what does for all mean and kind of conceptualizing that, I just think it's so important because, we hear kind of different conceptualizations around who the intended patient population is and who that's representative of. And so I think clearly defining that is super important. I would love to hear kind of a little bit more. There's, a number of things involved in thinking about operationalizing DE&I on the ground in trials that include, sites that are outside of the US and kind of trying to think practically about what first steps you take as a CRO that's working closely with sites to operationalize that. I would love to hear kind of how you kind of start and what you really think about the beginning.
Wonderful question. Yeah. And so I second your sentiment because when we speak about diversity, we really are having a context specific discussion. And therefore, that is why I'm such a big proponent of something, that you all have really contributed, I think, to our industry, which is following a methodology, because you must take into consideration a number of driving forces that are going to change with the context of every product, of every disease, of every country that you are considering work in, and the combination thereof. So, for example, the disease may call for a context to consider the industry that people work in. And therefore, when you think about how you might operationalize that in a particular country, you may not be necessarily relying on historical types of real world evidence, such as claims data or otherwise. That may not be available, but it may behoove you to look at, where those industries exist and where people who work in those industries live. It may be a particular context where the time that you've been in country impacts your treatment experience. And therefore, we may want to look at census data and directional census data. And so when we talk about those dimensions, that is really, in my opinion, when you get to the bottom of those dimensions and the relevance of those dimensions in context, you can really marry that goal and that context to an operational plan that's really practical and tactical and hopefully will be impactful.
Such good advice. And I think really thinking about discussing with sites and with countries and communities what their real challenges are, what their needs are for the research, what their context is within that specific condition that you're studying. It's so important to get really that grasp about what their priorities are, and for diversity as well. What is the priority for, we may think it may be race and ethnicity in the United States, but they may not define that the same way or even consider that a priority. It may be income level, or it could be, as you say, if it's something that people are subject to within their workspace, maybe that's the greater priority, is the industry or kind of the labor, the labor aspect. So really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Complex, I would say, for sure.
Definitely. So I wanted to next ask, so one issue, as we're trying to all navigate in this space, one thing that we hear come up a lot is the importance of early and clear communication between sponsors and CROs, or between sponsors and sites on diversity plans. So in your experience, what do you think might help improve that communication, that kind of flow, whether, top down, bottom up, how does that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I echo the sentiment that having conversations or beginning conversations as early as possible really maximize our opportunity to collaborate and have impact across stakeholders. And so when we think of timing, early could be as early as 9 to 12 months in advance of an anticipated project. So really just kind of setting that expectation and normalizing that. I think next, really simple approaches will go a long way. So doing things like defining diversity action plan, Are we having a discussion that refers to the formal document that is requested by the FDA? Or are we having a discussion about the contribution of a particular stakeholder and how they contribute to the process? We often see questions that ask or pose questions that ask, what is your plan for diversity? To which clarifying questions must be applied. And therefore, I recommend that we have those clarifying questions ready as part of that methodology to really help us hone in and better explore what we're discussing and come up with a plan. Questions like, who is setting the target for enrollment, and what are the analysis goals for this stage of development, and how does that kind of connect to the overall plans that we're discussing? What data is being leveraged to make those decisions? What is the source for patient and community input or information? What is the time point that the discussion is taking place? And then what is the next key impact point that we need to prioritize as a collaborative group? We find that operating from a plan that contains answers to these important questions can really help us have a much more successful collaboration with clearly defined scope and goals that also maximize what each stakeholder's contribution can be and to really position them well for success.
I'm so glad you kind of defined what some of those questions are. I think that would be super helpful to everyone involved. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question there. This kind of list of questions, I think you're probably developing, as you go and learn from experience, but is it kind of a standard list of questions that you're kind of finding across the board that needs to be tweaked a bit depending on the trial? Like, do you have kind of a standard set and then you have sort of an additional addendum depending on where you are? Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thankfully, and you're absolutely right, experience is really driving this, but we are putting together, for example, we have a strategy document, and in that strategy document, we have sort of general questions for sponsors. We have general questions for potential site and community partners. We also, within that, have supplemental or follow-up questions and trees, if you will, that sort of work off of these that are dependent upon therapeutic area. Sometimes there are specific questions that would only be applicable to certain therapeutic areas and not others. And so we are trying, for the purposes, obviously, of scale, because the DE&I team cannot be in every conversation and in every call. And so we're working to develop these tools to enable our teams to have the right set of questions, to gain the right set of perspective in order to put together the most successful strategic operational plan.
Thanks so much. Yeah. And I think your point about scale of the DE&I team and of the staff, I mean, we hear that so many times about the capacity of teams, wherever they are, but particularly at sites, to be able to implement this and kind of what are the strategies to streamline that a little bit. I think that's really a critical point to make.
Yeah, I would love to just follow up. And you mentioned sites, and I think it's so critical to really begin to conceptualize sites as partners, and especially in the diversity approach, because when we ask questions, what are you going to do for diversity, without being able to articulate what a sponsor has done or what we have done, maybe a sponsor has done from an eligibility standpoint or from a protocol standpoint, what a CRO may have done from an operational or tools standpoint, how we all really collaborate together, quite honestly, to minimize patient and community burden, to minimize site burden, and to enable them, really is a conversation that is really important to have in the beginning. And that really is what we're trying to get to with all of these questions.
Really interesting and such a great point. I wanted to ask one more on this subject of sites and, expanding trials to novel sites. I think traditionally the model has been that sponsors go to the same sites that they consider to be historically capable. But as we're thinking about diversity, a lot of the places where potential participants aren't necessarily where those original sites that sponsors have traditionally gone to are. So I think there's a lot of interest in building capacity of less experienced sites, to work with more diverse participants. And I'm just curious, in your experience, how do funders and CROs know where the best possibilities are for new sites or for scaling up sites that might not be new, but might not have done that particular kind of work before?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And I think there's a, multi-pronged purpose in our industry. I think, we have a general shortage of sites. In addition to what you described as having a shortage of sites who are serving what we would consider historically underserved patients. And so this is a really important endeavor that many stakeholders are beginning to collaborate on, which is fantastic. So I would say the approach, there are ways that we can utilize both data and our networks to accomplish these goals while protecting the integrity of the data that we seek to collect in the clinical trial process, while at the same time widening access to clinical trials and bringing these new sites into the fold. So for more naive or naive sites, I think a really good starting place for individual organizations is to consider real-world evidence. Claims, registry data, and other data exist that tell us, who are seeing some of these patients that are not necessarily participating in clinical trials, and then combining that data with a comprehensive plan that includes a roadmap to full participation, whether that starts as sort of a hub and spoke model whereby you begin with an introduction and a referral experience while building capacity that might include training and increased oversight and support and risk management to become an independent site, or that you're at the point where you're ready to start to take on trials, but still need that training, increased oversight, support, and risk management. Those are ways that CROs and other partners who are managing operations can have that solution ready to apply. I think the other way is also to look at existing industry partnerships and other conglomerations that are seeking to make sort of these ecosystem impacts on a more larger scale than maybe just individual sites within a trial or within a therapeutic group. Those might be industry collaborations. We happen to be part of a couple. One which has a grant program that is giving funds directly to sites who are seeing patients who are historically underrepresented, but need some aspect of support in order to overcome the wall, if you will, that's preventing them from having the capability to participate. There's others that are helping build capacity in different ways, such as providing training, providing resources, setting up mentorships, and other sort of capacity building endeavors that are not necessarily tied to specific funding needs, but that are really much more operational in nature. And so I would say look for those opportunities, certainly support those opportunities when you hear from them, but also on those individual study levels and program levels. To your point, you don't have to go in, with 30% of your sites being naive. Start small, set your goals, pace yourself, but have a roadmap for inclusion.
So much. I think it's your last point I really respond to, that you don't have to, we used to say when I lived in Africa, bite off the whole elephant at once, just kind of, start with where you can. And it also just sounds to me like we're in a sort of a newer space now where collaboration is really becoming paramount, to be able to do this in a way that's ethical and supportive of the needs of, these new research environments. And really that needs to be done kind of across industry and across collaborators. So I wanted to just give a huge thank you to you for sharing such a wealth of experience today. I mean, I've learned so much already just in our short time. And I wanted to give you kind of a chance to say, anything that you have last buzzing in your brain, and then we'll
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to echo the sentiment and say that when people within my organization want to volunteer and work with what we're trying to do, the very first thing that I send them to is the MRCT training and the guideline and toolkit. And so I want to thank you as well, just for the wealth of information that you've contributed to the industry. I do see, I think yours was probably one of the earliest collaborations that had tremendous impact. And I see more and more of us in these sort of cross-functional, multi-organizational, work streams and efforts to work together and to collaborate. And so I would say, thank you for being a pioneer in that space and for encouraging the rest of us to find ways to share information, to share best practice, to not see this as the competitive endeavor. We really do see a ton of collaboration around this, and I'm hopeful for what this means for patients in the future.
Well, we're so thrilled to be able to collaborate with you and, just everyone we work with. So onward together.
Absolutely.
All right, take care, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Since 2009, the MRCT Center has been an independent, pre-competitive convener engaging diverse stakeholders from industry, academia, patients and patient advocacy groups, nonprofit organizations, and regulatory agencies to deliver ethical, actionable, and practical solutions for the global clinical trial enterprise. Our resources are freely available at mrctcenter.org. Follow us on LinkedIn and sign up to receive our monthly newsletter on our website. Finally, please like and subscribe to this podcast channel. We really look forward to many exciting discussions to come. Thank you for listening.